On a fog-shrouded night in Charleston, South Carolina, two women brought life into the world only hours apart inside the grand Petton mansion. One was a French countess, the other her enslaved servant. Yet by the first light of dawn, neither newborn lay in the cribs where they had been placed. Instead, two different infants slept there, children destined to inherit fortunes they were never meant to claim. What followed was a deception of breathtaking scale, unfolding quietly over 34 years. Forged papers whispered into the hands of officials, disappearances staged as if by fate, and carefully chosen deaths that silenced anyone who knew too much. When the scheme finally collapsed in 1865, it shattered not only one of America's wealthiest dynasties, but revealed a hidden network of similar plots woven throughout the antebellum South. The truth of that night lingered only in courthouse archives and secret letters, until a mysterious fire in 1923 erased much of the evidence forever. Before we descend further into the tale of Countess Margaret de Villefort and her perilous pact, we must pause for a moment. We invite our community of mystery seekers to join us. Subscribe, share where you're listening from, and know that your presence helps us recover more of these forgotten shadows of history. For what makes this story so haunting is how one night's desperate choice rippled through decades, ensnaring politicians, judges, and the very pillars of society in ways they never foresaw. Charleston in 1830 one glowed as the crown of Southern elegance. Its cobblestone avenues wound between towering mansions, each the pride of America's cotton aristocracy. And at its heart stood the Petton estate, a property so vast it consumed an entire city block along East Bay Street. Its Georgian facade loomed 3 stories high, gazing out over the harbor where merchant ships arrived each day, their hulls groaning beneath the weight of treasures from across the Atlantic. But behind those proud walls, shadows had already begun to stir. Their ships carried luxuries destined for the drawing rooms of the wealthy. Spanish moss hung heavy from the live oaks surrounding the estate, casting shadows that deepened the sense of old-world elegance. It was a grandeur that seemed perfectly tailored for its residents. At the head of this domain stood Colonel Harrison Petton, a third-generation planter whose fortune rested upon rice and cotton. At 52, his presence commanded respect across Charleston. He held a seat on the city council and hosted grand dinners for visiting dignitaries. His hands, roughened by reins and tools, revealed a man who still patrolled his lands daily, overseeing the 3,000 acres of Carolina low country that stretched in every direction. Yet it was not the colonel who captivated Charleston's elite. It was his young French wife. Countess Margaret de Villefort had crossed the ocean just 3 years earlier, escaping the political upheavals that had shaken France after the July Revolution. At 28, she seemed the embodiment of European refinement. Porcelain skin framed by amber eyes that glimmered with unspoken secrets, and a regal bearing that made the wives of Charleston's aristocracy appear provincial beside her. She spoke 4 languages with effortless grace, and played the piano with such skill that entire drawing rooms fell silent at the first touch of her hands upon the keys. When she arrived, she had not only brought trunks of Parisian gowns and heirloom jewels, but also Celeste, a young attendant who never left her side. Celeste was unlike the others in the household. Taught by the Countess herself during the long Atlantic voyage, she could read and write in both French and English. At 25, she carried an intelligence sharpened by silence, her every word carefully measured. Her light complexion and delicate features often misled visitors into mistaking her for a free woman of color, an illusion the Countess never corrected. As the months passed, the balance of the household grew more delicate. For though Colonel Petton displayed devotion to his dazzling wife, he harbored the unspoken habits that many planters shared. His midnight wanderings toward the quarters were whispered about in Charleston's parlors, though never acknowledged aloud. Southern society demanded silence in the face of such indiscretions, even when they bore the quiet weight of children born in shadow, children whose lives would blur the lines of family and fate. Celeste had caught the colonel's eye almost from the moment she arrived. Her poise and learning set her apart from the rest of the household, and soon Petton was summoning her to his study in the evenings. Officially, these meetings were for help with correspondence in French, yet they stretched later into the night with each passing week. By the autumn of 1830, whispers spread quietly among the servants about the colonel's growing fascination. Meanwhile, the Countess herself had found companionship of a different kind, an unlikely friendship with Dr. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a fellow exile from France who had built a respected medical practice among Charleston's upper class. Rousseau, striking in his early 30s, carried the fiery eyes and restless energy of a revolutionary. Once, in Paris, he had published pamphlets denouncing slavery, words that had forced him into exile. In Charleston, he kept those beliefs hidden, tending instead to the city's wealthiest families. His presence in the Petton mansion grew more frequent, summoned under the pretense of treating the Countess's nervous conditions, a polite phrase for the unease that shadowed her adjustment to the Carolina heat. Their consultations, carried out in rapid French, often stretched into hours. The staff could not follow the words, but they noted the change in the Countess when she emerged from these sessions. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes alive with a brightness rarely seen since her arrival. By the close of 1830, both women of the household carried undeniable signs of expectancy. The Countess, radiant with joy, attributed her condition to the blessings of the Carolina air and her husband's devotion. Colonel Petton, eager for an heir, praised the news publicly, though his private attention seemed fixed elsewhere, on business, on the fields, on anything but his wife's growing belly. Celeste's own condition, however, was handled with quiet discretion. Such matters were hardly rare in plantation households and passed without scandal. The Countess, calm and practical, explained to her husband that her attendant would no longer be fit for heavy duties. She arranged for Celeste to be moved into a small cottage on the estate grounds, under the guise of ensuring her well-being. As the spring months unfolded, both pregnancies advanced, yet the Countess herself began to betray a nervousness that no one could quite explain. Her husband noticed the change, though he said little. The Countess now wandered the gardens alone, her steps slow, her gaze heavy, pausing often near the cottage where Celeste stayed. Their conversations, brief and hushed, were noted by the staff who, trained to read every shift in the household, sensed a tension that thickened as the due dates drew near. The truth behind that tension would not surface for another 34 years, yet its roots had already burrowed deep into the soil of the Petton estate. The child the Countess carried was not her husband's, and Celeste's condition was the result of the Colonel's midnight visits. Both women knew the ruin that would follow if the truth slipped free. For the Countess, disgrace and exile from Charleston's glittering society. For Celeste, the loss of her child, a fate that had claimed so many before her. On the night of March 15th, 1831, a storm broke over Charleston with a fury that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside the mansion. Rain hammered against the tall windows as wind tore through the live oaks, their branches creaking like ancient timbers at sea. Lightning split the harbor into white flashes, revealing ships straining at anchor as the waves battered the seawall. Inside the mansion, the Countess paced the candle-lit halls, her hand clutching her swollen belly as the first contractions gripped her. Labor had begun at sunset, just as the storm clouds gathered. In her cottage nearby, Celeste too fought through her own pains, tended by Mama Ruth, the elderly midwife who had seen generations of children born under shadows like these. By midnight, Dr. Russell arrived, his black coat soaked through, his medical bag clutched tightly as he hurried through the pounding rain. For once his composure faltered. Ushered upstairs, he found the Countess gripping the bedpost, her golden hair damp and clinging to her temples, her knuckles white as each wave of pain struck. Downstairs, Colonel Petton remained fixed in his study, holding to the Southern custom that kept men far from the raw business of childbirth. Outside, the storm intensified. The Countess gasped through her contractions, her amber eyes fixed on each blaze of lightning that split her chamber with ghostly brilliance. Perhaps it was an omen, she whispered. Dr. Russell knelt beside her bed, pressing her wrist with steady fingers. Storms often accompany births, he murmured in French, his voice calm though his hands betrayed a faint tremor. It is nature's rhythm. The night seemed to understand the weight of what was unfolding. As the hours crept toward dawn, two women labored in parallel struggles, separated by less than 50 yards, yet worlds apart. The Countess's cries, smothered by silk pillows and the heavy walls of the mansion, mingled with the storm outside. In the cottage, Celeste clenched down on a strip of leather, muffling her pain so no sound would betray her. Mama Ruth moved between them, her steps steady, her mind sharpened by decades of experience. At 73, she had ushered countless children into the world, bearing witness to both miracles and secrets. Her worn hands carried the quiet authority of a woman trusted by Charleston's most powerful families. But what she would see on this night would challenge even her vow of silence. The Countess delivered first. Just as the storm began to break at 4 in the morning, Dr. Russell lifted a child into the flickering candlelight. His hands trembled as he studied her small, perfect face. Olive-toned skin, dark hair, the unmistakable features of his own blood. This was his daughter, not the colonel's heir. "She is beautiful," he whispered in French, but the joy in his voice collapsed beneath the gravity of the truth. If Colonel Petton saw this child, there would be no escaping the questions. Less than an hour later in the cottage, Mama Ruth delivered Celeste's son, a boy with pale skin and the unmistakable Petton nose, a mark that had passed through 3 generations. The irony struck her with force. She had been present when Harrison Petton himself was born, and she recognized the resemblance instantly. As dawn crept over Charleston, turning the drenched streets into rivers of gold, two women stared into the faces of futures they could not control. The Countess held her daughter, knowing that to present this child as her husband's heir would mean ruin, exposure, and exile. Celeste cradled her son, aware that while his fair skin might spare him from the back-breaking toil of the fields, he would remain bound in chains, denied his rightful name. And in the silence of that fragile morning, it was Dr. Russell who dared to give voice to the thought that lingered unspoken in every heart. After ensuring that Colonel Petton remained distracted by the storm's damage to his lands, the doctor returned to the Countess's chamber. She sat holding her newborn, her amber eyes clouded by fear, as he stepped closer and began to speak. He spoke with quiet urgency, his words trembling beneath the weight of reality. "We must consider the practical consequences," he whispered, his voice steady only because of habit, not conviction. Her husband expected an heir, a son. If he were to see this child, questions would ignite like fire through dry fields. The Countess's amber eyes glistened, but her upbringing had taught her to endure catastrophe with measured grace. "I know what you are suggesting, Jean-Baptiste," she answered, her tone calm yet heavy. "But how could such a deception ever take place?" The reply came not from him but from the shadowed doorway. Mama Ruth stood there, her ancient face etched with lines that carried decades of secrets. "Miss Margot," she began softly, her voice layered with caution, "there might be a way to shield both these children." Her words drifted into the room like smoke from fading candles, delicate yet impossible to ignore. She alone had brought both infants into the world within hours of one another, and she alone grasped the true magnitude of their danger. More than a midwife, she carried the unspoken knowledge of how families on these lands concealed truths and bent bloodlines. "Celeste's boy," she continued in a whisper, "could be raised as yours, and your little girl she could live as Celeste's daughter. Two lives exchanged, two futures preserved in opposite directions." The Countess felt the ground shift beneath her, as if the very earth had turned to sand after the storm. The idea was monstrous, a deception that clawed at her soul, yet it offered the only escape that promised survival. Her daughter, doomed to a life in shadows, yet spared immediate danger. Celeste's son, rising into wealth that belonged to him by blood, though never by name. Dr. Russell exhaled slowly, already seeing the challenges. "The records," he said gravely, "they would have to be rewritten. And your husband, he must never suspect." Celeste had been summoned from the cottage once the colonel rode out to survey storm damage. She listened without flinching, her expression hardened by years of knowing life's imbalance. For her son, this deception promised everything: education, fortune, freedom. For her mistress's daughter, it promised chains disguised as protection. The irony cut like a blade, sharp and merciless. "And what guarantee do I have?" Celeste asked, her voice low but piercing. "What stops you from taking my child and discarding me once this charade is in place?" The Countess raised her gaze, her voice quiet yet unwavering, and in that moment the candlelight flickered as if the house itself leaned in to hear her reply. "Because we will both be bound," she said, "to a secret that, if broken, will destroy us both." They were bound together now, equally trapped within a secret that could never be spoken aloud. Her silence would shield the Countess's daughter, while the Countess's protection would secure Celeste's son. Neither woman could betray the other without destroying the very future they most longed to preserve. As dawn lifted over Charleston, the storm-washed city gleamed under pale sunlight, but inside the Petton estate, a pact had been forged, one that would shape the fate of two families for generations. Dr. Russell agreed to alter the records, inscribing his name as attending physician for both births, though only one child would appear in the official account, a healthy son born to the Countess. Celeste would take the other infant, the little girl with her mother's striking features, and present her as her own. Before Colonel Petton returned from his inspections, Mama Ruth moved with solemn precision, swaddling the newborns and exchanging them with hands steady from decades of practiced care. When the moment came, the Countess cradled the boy who was not hers by blood, marveling at how perfectly he fulfilled the role of heir. Yet when her gaze fell on Celeste, holding the girl who was truly her daughter, a new and consuming instinct began to stir. What had started as survival now grew into something darker, an obsessive protectiveness that would haunt her for decades. The performance began immediately, a fragile illusion demanding constant vigilance. Still, it held. Colonel Petton accepted his heir with pride, bestowing the boy with a grand name, Charles Harrison Petton, after his own ancestor. The child thrived, growing into a striking toddler with fair skin and the unmistakable features of Charleston's aristocracy. Visitors admired him endlessly, remarking on his resemblance to his father, and speaking confidently of the dynasty he would someday inherit. At the same time, the Countess devoted herself to the girl named Marie, the daughter she could never acknowledge. Officially, Marie was recorded as the child of a house servant. Yet the Countess insisted she be educated alongside young Charles, explaining it away with claims that the boy required a companion and that the girl displayed unusual intelligence. Her relatives and neighbors found the arrangement odd, whispering among themselves about her curious attachment to a slave child. But outwardly, they accepted her explanation. And so the years passed, with Dr. Russo returning often under the guise of physician, secretly tending to the delicate web of deception they had spun that stormy night. The secret demanded constant vigilance. Dr. Russo monitored both children with meticulous care, noting every resemblance, every subtle trait that might one day betray the truth. He became not just their physician, but the silent architect of their disguise. The first true test of this deception came when young Charles reached his 5th year. From the very beginning, he revealed a brilliance that startled even those who expected much of him. He devoured books with uncanny speed, solved problems beyond his age, and showed a gift for music that rivaled the Countess herself. But it was not just his genius that troubled those around him, it was his questions. One afternoon in 1836, during a gathering of Charleston's elite, Charles turned to the Countess with an unsettling curiosity. "Why do I look different from Cousin Edmund?" he asked, his sharp eyes fixed on her face. "His hair is lighter and his skin darkens in the sun. Mine does not." For the first time, the Countess felt her carefully crafted illusion tremble. She forced a calm smile and replied, "Children take after different branches of their families. You favor your father's side, while Edmund resembles his mother." But Charles was far too intelligent to accept such hollow comforts. His questions multiplied, each one sharper than the last. And in those same years, he grew inseparably close to Marie. Though only 5 herself, Marie shared with him an unspoken bond that unsettled the adults around them. The children finished each other's sentences. They seemed to think as one, their connection so uncanny it bordered on the supernatural. To outsiders, it appeared innocent companionship. To those who knew the truth, it was dangerously revealing. Celeste, now elevated to head of the household staff, observed quietly from the shadows. Pride swelled within her as she watched the boy who was truly her own flesh and blood flourish. Yet heartbreak lingered too, for she could never claim him. She guided him subtly, offering whispers of wisdom, small lessons in resilience, while shielding him from the harsher cruelties of plantation life. But every triumph for Charles came at a cost. For Marie, the child she birthed but could never acknowledge, the story was different. Celeste loved her deeply, yet sorrow clung to every glance. The girl's brilliance was dimmed by her place in society, her gifts overshadowed by the privileges her brother unknowingly inherited. The Countess, meanwhile, grew consumed by a desperate need for control. She oversaw their studies with obsessive precision, dictated their companions, and scrutinized their every conversation for hints of recognition. Her anxiety, cloaked beneath the mask of maternal care, gnawed at her health and strained her social ties. Dr. Russo, watching from the periphery, saw the toll it was taking. He alone understood that their fragile performance was beginning to unravel. The deception pressed upon the household like a weight no one could bear. During his visits, he noticed the Countess's hands trembling as she watched Charles play, the way Celeste's eyes lingered on her true son with a longing she could not conceal, and how both children seemed to carry an unspoken awareness that their lives were built on fragile illusions. The tension deepened as Charleston society began whispering about the household's peculiarities. In a city where wealthy planters often favored certain slaves, the Countess's treatment of young Marie went beyond indulgence. She placed the girl in the same tutoring sessions as Charles, dressed her in garments too fine for her station, and allowed her to sit at family meals when no outsiders were present. That French woman spoils her house slaves beyond all reason, murmured Mrs. Cornelius Whitlock during a genteel tea in 1837. Mark my words, such permissiveness leads to ruin. Slaves who forget their place become dangerous. The words spread through drawing rooms like a chill draft, and soon they reached Colonel Petton himself. For the first time since their marriage, he began to question his wife's judgment. The confrontation came one evening behind the closed doors of his study, and it nearly tore their carefully woven facade apart. "Margot," he began, voice low but edged with iron, "I've been hearing troubling reports about your management of the slaves. Most concerning is that girl you've taken such a liking to." The Countess felt her blood turn cold, though her aristocratic training held her expression steady. "Marie is unusually gifted," she answered with practiced calm. "I thought it wise for Charles to have an educated companion, someone who could aid his studies when other children were absent." Petton's eyes hardened. "Educated slaves become dangerous slaves, and the neighbors are already whispering about your attachments. It tarnishes our name." His words carried the unmistakable weight of warning. The Countess understood in that moment how narrow the path beneath her feet had become. She was balancing the need to protect her daughter with the fragile deception surrounding her son. One misstep, one indulgence too far, and scrutiny would follow, scrutiny that could expose the truth of both children's bloodlines. That night, as the house lay silent around her, she made a choice that would echo through every corner of her life, haunting her long after the candlelight had burned away. For the rest of her life, the decision would haunt her. In her private chambers, the Countess summoned Celeste and delivered the words that shattered both their hearts. "Marie must be sold," she whispered, her voice steady though tears ran freely down her cheeks. "My husband suspects too much. If she remains here, everything we built will collapse." Celeste froze, her world tilting. This was the one fate they had never prepared for when they made their pact 6 years earlier. "You swore she would be safe," Celeste said, her voice breaking. "And she will be," the Countess insisted desperately. "I will place her with a family in Savannah, people who will care for her, educate her, protect her from discovery." The bitter irony was cruel beyond words. To preserve the illusion that gave Charles his inheritance, the Countess had to cast away her own daughter into bondage in a distant city. Celeste saw the terrible logic, even as it tore apart the bond she had nurtured for 6 years. But Marie's departure left behind an unexpected storm. Charles, now 6, unraveled in grief. He would not eat, he refused to speak. The light of curiosity and joy that once animated him faded to silence. And then came the questions, sharp, unrelenting questions. Where had Marie gone? Why could she not return? His words chilled every adult who heard them. "She was my sister," he declared with the solemn certainty only a child could possess. "Not my slave, my sister. And sisters should never be sold." The statement struck like thunder through the household, a truth no one dared acknowledge. Dr. Russo, uneasy at the boy's despair, suggested it was a dangerous instability, a matter of the mind requiring treatment. But the Countess recognized it for what it truly was. The two children shared a bond that went deeper than bloodlines or appearances, a bond that seemed to whisper truths no one else could speak aloud. Charles somehow sensed that Marie was tied to his own identity in ways the deception could never conceal. And so the Countess arranged the sale through shadows and intermediaries, erasing every trace that might one day betray her secret. Marie was given to the Harrington family in Savannah, with whispers that she was a house slave spoiled by her former owners. To mask the truth, the Countess added a generous payment, a bribe hidden as kindness, ensuring the girl would receive an education and gentle treatment. Yet she could never reveal the real reason for such generosity. On the morning of her departure, Marie was hidden in the back of a merchant's wagon. The wheels creaked against the cobblestones as the city awoke. From separate windows of the mansion, both women stood frozen, each watching the same child vanish down the road, their daughter carried away into a future neither could ever follow. Down the tree-lined avenue, the wagon rolled away, carrying Marie into the distance. Neither woman could reveal her grief, yet it burned through their bodies in silence. The Countess's hands clutched the window frame so tightly her knuckles turned bone white, while Celeste's shoulders trembled with sobs she dared not release. Outside, Charles sprinted after the wagon, his small frame chasing the impossible. For nearly a quarter mile he ran before the coachman lifted him, thrashing and screaming, back to the mansion. His cries, "Bring back my sister," ripped through the neighborhood, echoing against the great houses of Charleston. Families on nearby verandas exchanged knowing looks, their eyes narrowing at the strange mysteries of the Petton household. In the years that followed, the absence of Marie carved an unhealed wound in their world. Charles, just 7, seemed to vanish into himself. Privilege could not soothe his melancholy. His mind expanded at a terrifying pace, mastering Latin before 8, weaving arguments like a young lawyer. But his spirit remained fragile, fractured. Worse still, something else stirred within him, an uncanny gift for sensing deception. It was as if the loss of his sister had sharpened his vision, turning suspicion into second nature. He questioned everything, noticed what others overlooked, and pursued truths with unnerving clarity. The Countess responded by tightening her control. She poured her every thought into shaping Charles's destiny. Tutors of the highest reputation were brought into the mansion, each carefully chosen, each watched under her relentless eye. She guided his lessons, steered his readings, and began constructing a future that would lift the Petton name among America's most enduring dynasties. But her vigilance carried a hidden price. The boy she studied so intensely began to study her in return. "Mother," he asked one morning in 1838, his voice steady, his eyes too knowing for a child, "why do you watch me so closely when you think I am not looking?" The question landed like a dagger, leaving her breathless. "All mothers watch their children," she answered, struggling to steady her tone. But Charles did not relent. "Not like you. You watch me as if you fear I might vanish. And when you think no one sees, you look sad. Why would I make you sad?" Such conversations grew more frequent, each one digging deeper, each one chipping at the mask she wore. With every year, Charles's brilliance evolved into something formidable, something dangerous. The very gifts that could one day secure his place in history might also unearth the secrets buried in his past. Meanwhile, Celeste had risen to a new role, head housekeeper of the mansion. From this vantage, she gained unprecedented access to the family's private affairs, and quietly she began to gather. Celeste moved through the mansion with quiet purpose, her new position granting her access to the very heart of the Petton household. On the surface, she oversaw linens and silver, but beneath that facade she gathered information about Charles's remarkable development and more secretly about Marie's fate in Savannah. A hidden network of whispered messages carried across plantations like smoke in the wind, and through it she learned that Marie was indeed safe, cared for, and astonishingly gifted. The same precocious brilliance that defined Charles seemed to shine within her as well, like two mirrors reflecting the same hidden flame. Dr. Russo's visits continued, yet his role had shifted. He was no longer merely the family physician, but the uneasy guardian of their secret, offering counsel as much as medicine. The years of deception had left scars. The Countess was plagued by headaches that throbbed like a ticking clock, her nerves fraying in the quiet hours of night. Celeste carried the stillness of a coiled spring, a woman forever expecting disaster. This cannot continue indefinitely, Russell warned in 1839, his voice low, urgent. Charles is too intelligent, too observant. One day he will see through the cracks in this story. His warning, spoken beneath candlelight, felt like prophecy, and it proved true sooner than any of them imagined. In the summer of 1840, when Charles was 9, the secret stirred dangerously close to the surface. While wandering the mansion's vast library, he found a drawer carelessly left unlatched. Inside lay a bundle of his mother's papers, brittle and faded with time. Among them rested a letter written by Dr. Russo to the Countess years earlier, its ink still sharp enough to wound. In it, the doctor spoke of a delicate arrangement, of vigilance, of an exchange. Charles's young mind could not grasp every detail, but he understood enough to sense betrayal, and one detail struck him like a lightning bolt. The letter spoke of Marie. That evening, seated at the grand dining table beneath the glow of flickering candelabras, Charles turned his eyes upon his supposed parents. His voice was calm, steady, yet devastating. "What exchange were you and Dr. Russ discussing in your letter about Marie and me?" The words seemed to freeze the air. A silence followed, thick, suffocating, endless. Colonel Petton, oblivious to the truth, looked bewildered. The Countess felt the room tilt, as if the earth itself had betrayed her. And Celeste, standing silently with the servants, understood with dreadful clarity that the moment they had feared for 9 long years had finally arrived. The Countess forced her lips into a smile, her aristocratic training holding her upright even as her heart collapsed. "I don't know what you mean, darling," she replied softly, but Charles had inherited more than brilliance. In his piercing gaze lay an instinct sharper than any blade, an ability to sense when a lie had been spoken. "You do know," he whispered, the words sharp as broken glass. "And one day I'm going to uncover the truth about what really happened, the night I was born." The declaration, spoken from the lips of a mere 9-year-old, froze the air in that candle-lit room. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was the opening shot of a war against decades of carefully constructed lies. Those gathered sensed it instantly. Charles's mind, sharp and relentless, would make him a dangerous enemy within his own household. Later that night, Colonel Petton pressed his wife for answers, troubled by the boy's words. The Countess, veiled in composure, spun a deflection about some misunderstood letter concerning household purchases. But beneath her calm surface, she saw the shadow of doubt flickering in her husband's eyes, and she knew that shadow would only grow darker. From that moment forward, the boy became an investigator in his own home. He pressed the enslaved servants for memories of that storm-tossed night, examined family portraits as if searching for ghosts, even wrote to distant relatives in France, trying to piece together the fragments of his origin. All paths inevitably led back to Celeste. She, as head housekeeper, was keeper of records, overseer of testimony, and though no one dared speak it aloud, his true mother. Now she found herself trapped between duty and blood, deception and survival. "Miss Celeste," he asked her one afternoon in 1841, his tone respectful but his eyes unflinching, "do you remember anything unusual about the night I was born?" Her heartbeat thundered, but her face remained carved in stone. Years of enslavement had taught her silence as armor. "It was a terrible storm," she replied softly. "Worst I ever saw. Trees falling, rain like Judgment Day." Charles leaned closer, his gaze unrelenting. "And what about Marie? Wasn't she born around that same time?" The question hung in the room like smoke refusing to clear. Celeste knew her next words might shape both their fates. "Lots of Bobbies born in storms," she answered at last. Seems storms bring children into the world, but I was only helping Mama Ruth. Not my place to notice such things. Charles studied her face, searching for fractures in her mask. His eyes, so piercingly like her own, left her breathless. You cared for Marie, he pressed quietly, more than most slaves would care for another's child. Marie was a sweet child, Celeste admitted, allowing real warmth to slip into her voice. Anyone would have loved that little girl. But Charles's gaze softened, but only for a moment. I still dream of her, he whispered, dreams where she's still alive. And in that whisper, Celeste felt the walls of deception tremble. She was not really your daughter at all, he murmured, but something else, someone else. The words dissolved into silence, but Celeste understood their weight. Charles's conscious mind had not yet solved the puzzle, but in dreams, his subconscious was already walking dangerous paths. He was dreaming himself toward the truth, and no barrier of secrecy could hold him forever. That same year, outside forces pressed in with relentless urgency. Colonel Petton's health faltered, his decline stirring whispers of inheritance and succession that the Countess had prayed to postpone for years. Now society's gaze turned to Charles, expecting him to step into the role of future master. With it came scrutiny of his talents, his lineage, his very blood. The Countess felt time itself closing in. Soon, Charles would demand answers no one was prepared to give. And when death came to the colonel, the paperwork required might expose fractures in the carefully constructed lie. The weight of deception pressed against every soul in that house, bending their stability to the breaking point. Yet the gravest threat emerged not within their walls but from beyond. In late 1841, whispers drifted from Savannah. Marie, only 10 years old, had begun to display extraordinary gifts of mind. Her brilliance astonished the Harrington family so profoundly that they contemplated sending her north for an advanced education, a prospect almost unthinkable for a child in bondage. But such an opportunity carried peril. If Marie gained knowledge and connections, she might one day unravel her own origins. Two children, separated by distance yet bound by blood and shadow, now moved on parallel paths toward revelations that could topple everything. The Countess, staring into this widening abyss, realized a choice was upon her. Protect the secret and cling to Charles's inheritance, or release the truth before it detonated in public scandal. But to preserve the lie demanded measures far darker than she had ever dared consider. By 1842, the carefully woven fabric of deception had begun to tear. Charles, now 11, had grown into a striking young figure, his intelligence sharpened by suspicion, his will hardened into steel. His questions no longer carried the innocence of childhood. They carried the force of a boy determined to hunt down the truth of his own creation. Charles's curiosity hardened into a methodical hunger for truth. He moved from idle questions to systematic investigations, showing a natural aptitude for legal reasoning and evidence gathering that unnerved the adults around him. The breaking point arrived when he discovered that Dr. Russo kept two journals, one public ledger for his practice, and a private book where he recorded patients' most delicate secrets. The boy had noticed the doctor's habit of slipping away to write in that private volume, and had quietly deduced where it must be hidden. One autumn afternoon, while accompanying his supposed mother on a social visit about his future education, Charles slipped from the adults and searched the doctor's study with the steady patience of someone tracing a trail. What he uncovered was worse than he had feared. The private journal held explicit notes about an exchange of infants, precise observations about each child's development, and entries listing substantial payments from the Countess to ensure silence. The pages sketched, in chilling detail, a conspiracy of switched children, forged records, and a decade of careful lies. But the journal offered something darker still, signs that Dr. Russell was fraying under the load of secrecy. Recent entries spoke of drinking to steady his hands, of paranoia, of guilt that bent his sentences into pleas. An August 1842 note read like a thermometer at the fever's height. His questions grow sharper each month. I fear his intelligence will one day expose us. The Countess speaks of measures that chill me. How long can we sustain this charade before it consumes us all? Even more alarming were letters from Savannah the doctor referenced, queries about Marie's unusual development, hints that she displayed features more akin to European aristocracy than to a child born into slavery. Charles copied the key passages with trembling hands, returned the journal to its hiding place, and rejoined the adults as if nothing had happened. He had just armed himself with proof that could destroy every life built around the lie. But as he folded those words into a plan, a colder awareness settled over him. Having the evidence was only the beginning. He now had to decide what to do with it, and that choice would set the next course for everyone in the Petton household. Charles finally understood enough to act. That evening, beneath the glow of flickering candlelight, he entered the Countess's private chambers and delivered his revelation with chilling simplicity. "I know about the exchange," he said, producing the copied journal entries like weapons. "I know Marie was your true daughter, and that I am the son of a slave. What I do not understand is why you have kept this lie alive for so long." The Countess froze, her world collapsing in silence. Yet her aristocratic training gave her composure even as her hands trembled. "If you truly grasp what those pages mean," she whispered, "then you also understand what exposing them would do to both of us." Charles's eyes burned with calculation. "You would be disgraced, cast out of society," he said, "and I would lose everything, inheritance, education, freedom itself. We are both chained by this secret." The Countess's voice, steady but tight, confirmed his conclusion. "Exactly. That is why it must never be spoken." But Charles was no longer thinking in terms of silence or exposure. His mind had already moved to leverage. "There is another person bound by this secret," he said, his voice colder than before. "My real mother, the woman who raised me yet has never been allowed to call me her son." The Countess felt her blood run cold. His words no longer carried the innocence of curiosity. They held the weight of demands. "Celeste has been well cared for," she replied quickly. "She holds a place in this house unlike any other." Charles's answer was sharper, more dangerous. "She is still a slave, and I live the life that was meant for Marie. These truths carry obligations." The threat beneath his words was undeniable. He was not simply asking for recognition. He was preparing to reshape the entire deception by his own hand. In the weeks that followed, Charles began moving with unnerving precision, like a strategist far older than his years. He approached Celeste directly, catching her in private moments where the Countess could not intervene. His words were steady, almost ceremonial. As he confronted her, "I know you are my mother," he said one morning while she supervised the polishing of his room. "And I know that somewhere in Savannah, my sister Marie lives in bondage while I enjoy a life that should have been hers." Celeste, though braced for this moment for years, still felt her breath catch. She had prepared for Charles's questions, but nothing could have prepared her for the chilling certainty in his tone. Hearing those words spoken aloud still stunned her into silence. She gazed at the boy who carried her blood, yet could never publicly claim her name, and understood in that moment that everything was about to shift. "What you know and what you can prove are not the same," she answered at last. her voice trained by years of survival to choose each word as though it were a weapon. "I can prove everything," Charles whispered in return. "Dr. Russo's journals hold the records of it all. But I do not seek destruction, I seek justice." His vision was as brilliant as it was terrifying. Charles intended to carefully divert pieces of his inheritance toward Celeste and Marie, creating a tangled web of legality that would shelter his true family while keeping the connection hidden from public view. He had already studied the laws with chilling precision and uncovered pathways to make it real. Yet the scheme demanded cooperation from all three of them. And Charles, with calm certainty, made it clear that if they resisted, he would bring everything into the open. In that instant, the boy seized command, not with power or wealth, but with intellect sharpened into a blade. The Countess recognized in him her own calculating nature reflected back, only carried by the unyielding clarity of youth. He had set before her a choice: surrender wealth slowly, or watch their entire world collapse, and they both knew which path she must take. But when the Countess revealed the boy's ultimatum to Dr. Russo, it became the first warning of how perilous their situation had grown. The doctor's fragile mind splintered completely. "He wants to ruin us all," Russo raged during a midnight storm at the mansion, his breath heavy with drink, his hands trembling with a feverish energy. "That child is no longer human. He is a demon sent to punish our sins." The Countess tried to steady him, but Russo's fear had turned to mania. He accused Charles of plotting their downfall, of weaving evidence that would see them tried for conspiracy and deceit. And then his voice sank lower, carrying a darker edge. If the boy could not be silenced by reason, then perhaps he could be silenced by fate. "One accident," Russo muttered into the candlelight. "A riding mishap, a fall from the heights of this very house." The suggestion of an accident hung in the air like poison. A fall from the roof, a slip while playing. Children perished in such ways all the time, and no one questioned tragedy. The Countess recoiled at the thought, yet she could not dismiss the doctor's desperation. Russo knew every detail of their deception, and his unraveling mind made him as dangerous as any confession or violent act. Meanwhile, Charles moved quietly in the background, writing under false names, slipping his letters through hidden channels. His inquiries reached Savannah, where he learned that Marie was showing unmistakable signs of refinement, intellect and grace far beyond what anyone expected from a child in bondage. The Harringtons, unsettled by her brilliance, began asking questions about her lineage. Their letters to Charleston pressed harder, searching for answers about Marie's parentage and history. Each one landed on Dr. Russo's desk, where he deflected with vague replies about ancestry and unusual inheritance, but suspicion was already taking root. By December of 1842, the tension reached a breaking point. Russo's crumbling reason twisted into a deadly resolve. Charles had formed the habit of evening walks through the gardens, using the silence to plot his intricate schemes of inheritance. One winter night, the doctor waited among the hedges, a pistol hidden in his trembling hands, ready to stage a false robbery and place the blame on fugitives. But Charles carried more than intelligence. He possessed an almost supernatural sense for danger. The moment he stepped into the moonlit garden, he felt the disturbance, as if the air itself whispered of betrayal. When Russo emerged from the shadows, pistol raised, Charles stood calmly, eyes fixed on the man meant to end his life. "Dr. Russo," he said softly, his voice cutting through the night with unsettling composure. He showed no fear, though the weapon was leveled at his chest. "I knew you would reach this conclusion. Your journals betray you page by page. They reek of desperation, and desperation always leads to ruin." Russo's hand shook as he held the pistol, his voice ragged with obsession. "You should have left well enough alone, boy. Some truths are too dangerous. But Charles countered with cold precision, his words slicing deeper than any bullet. Killing me will not preserve your secret. It will only expose it. I have already hidden everything I discovered, Charles said, his voice steady, almost chilling. And if anything happens to me, those papers will surface. My death would guarantee the very exposure you fear most. The bluff landed with devastating force, because in Charles's calm delivery it felt entirely believable. Russo's grip faltered, the pistol lowering as he realized he had been undone by an 11-year-old who thought 3 steps ahead of every adult around him. Yet Charles was not finished. His words carried the weight of judgment. You have become a danger to us all, he continued. Your drinking, your paranoia, your reckless impulses, every one of them threatens the very secret you swore to protect. Perhaps it is time you considered leaving Charleston altogether. The suggestion was more than advice. It was a sentence, enforced by the boy's cold intelligence and hidden leverage. Russell understood at last that his position had collapsed beyond repair. Within a week, his practice was sold, his affairs abandoned. He vanished from Charleston under the thin pretense of urgent family obligations, leaving behind only a brief farewell note. His departure removed the most volatile element of the conspiracy, but also stripped away the one man whose knowledge had helped sustain their deception. Charles watched him go with quiet satisfaction, though he knew the exile was only the beginning. Power was his now, but power carried burdens, burdens that would test his resolve in ways even he had not foreseen. Just when it seemed the storm had broken, Charleston's shadows darkened further. The tale was far from over. If this story has already unsettled you, share it with someone who craves the darker truths of history. Strike the like button and subscribe to uncover what lies ahead. For in the winter of 1843, Charles would confront the true cost of the justice he claimed to seek, forced at last to choose between revenge and redemption. And as spring approached, news arrived that none of them could escape, the reckoning of an 11-year deception. Marie, now 12 years old and living under the borrowed name Maria Harrington in Savannah, had drawn the watchful eyes of Northern abolitionists. These investigators, intent on exposing the hidden tragedies of slavery, had begun documenting children whose European features betrayed their true lineage. When they encountered Marie, her polished speech, classical learning, and unmistakable aura of refinement convinced them she was no ordinary child of bondage. She appeared instead to be a girl stolen from privilege, a life exchanged by cruel deception. The American Anti-Slavery Society prepared legal challenges, gathering evidence that would demand records, testimonies, and truths that had long been buried in shadows. Through his secret channels, Charles received word of these developments. He understood instantly that the fragile web of lies binding their lives together was now within reach of powerful hands: lawyers, abolitionists, and investigators who would dig without mercy. Yet Charles was no longer the frightened boy who had once stumbled upon a hidden letter in the library. At 12, his mind was sharpened into something formidable, each thought cut from steel. For months, he had crafted a plan designed not just to reveal the truth, but to weaponize it, securing Marie's freedom, providing for Celeste, and ensuring the Pettin name collapsed in disgrace. The chance arrived with the decline of Colonel Pettin himself. In May of 1843, the colonel suffered a stroke that left him half paralyzed, his voice mangled into fragments. Power drained from him like sand slipping through glass, and into the void stepped Charles. The Countess, drowning in the twin burdens of her husband's care and the looming legal turmoil of inheritance, struggled to keep her grip. Charleston's legal elite now looked toward young Charles as the heir in waiting, a boy expected to stand before judges and lawyers and prove the strength of his name and lineage. And it was here, beneath the weight of expectation and the flickering candlelight of Charleston's drawing rooms, that Charles began to set into motion the most daring phase of his grand design. Charles's plan unfolded with quiet precision. He approached Judge Samuel Thornberry, a longtime family confidant who had been entrusted with the early legal affairs of the Petton estate. Requesting a private audience, Charles revealed concerns about unsettling irregularities in his birth records. Thornberry, who had known the Pettons for decades, at first brushed aside the claims as the nervous imaginings of a youth overwhelmed by new responsibilities. But Charles pressed on, presenting his evidence with the calm, deliberate cadence of a seasoned advocate. Before the judge lay a collection of papers that, when pieced together, formed an undeniable portrait of fraud, deception, and identities switched beneath the surface of respectability. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he set the documents down. "These are grave accusations, young man," he said, his voice echoing in the hushed chamber. "If true, they would not only shatter your inheritance but expose your family to criminal disgrace." Charles did not falter. His expression carried the calm assurance that had become his shield. "I understand the weight of it," he replied evenly. "But justice demands that the truth be brought to light, no matter the personal cost." Thornberry studied him more intently now, seeing not the boy he had known, but a calculating figure with a quiet fire behind his words. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Charles's answer revealed the depth of his plan. He wished Thornberry to launch a formal inquiry into the false identities, but with careful design, to wound the Petton name beyond repair while protecting Marie and Celeste from legal peril. He had traced pathways through the law, routes that could unravel the family's deception without consigning Marie to enslavement or Celeste to charges of conspiracy. Thornberry's eyes narrowed. "You are asking me to help you bring ruin upon your own bloodline." Charles did not hesitate. "No, I am asking you to help me end a lie that has lasted 12 years. My mother deserves her freedom. My sister deserves her inheritance. Those truths outweigh the hollow comfort of a false legacy." After a long silence, the judge gave a slow nod. He would proceed with a discreet investigation, though he insisted on first attempting private negotiations with all involved. This choice opened one final window for the Countess to alter the tide of her son's campaign against their carefully woven deception. The confrontation came within the mansion's library, where the silence of old books and the stern gazes of ancestral portraits seemed to mock the secrets they concealed. Upstairs, Colonel Petton lay motionless, his body stilled by illness, while below, his family's empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The Countess's voice trembled as she whispered, "You have won." The Countess spoke softly, her aristocratic poise finally unraveling under the weight of months of fear and concealment. "What happens now?" Her voice lingered in the dim library like a confession. Charles paused, considering the question with the measured precision that had made him such a relentless adversary. "Marie returns to Charleston as my acknowledged sister and claims her rightful inheritance. Celeste will receive her freedom and with it security. And you, Countess, you will live with the weight of every choice you made." Her gaze narrowed, sharp as broken glass. "And you? What becomes of you when Charleston society learns that their heir is the son of a slave?" It was the one question Charles had avoided, the shadow that had followed him through every stage of his plan. His schemes had always centered on liberating others, never on himself. Revealing the truth would consume his own future just as surely as it would shatter hers. Yet he answered without hesitation, "I will face what comes. But I will face it knowing I chose truth over comfort, justice over privilege. The Countess studied him in silence, torn between admiration and ruin. "Do you realize," she whispered, "that Marie may not thank you for this? She has lived 12 years believing she was a slave. To learn she is aristocracy, robbed of her birthright, that truth may not bring the joy you expect." Her words struck Charles like an unseen blade, planting seeds of doubt that began to root deep within him, threatening to fracture the certainty that had guided his every move. The legal proceedings advanced with startling speed, each revelation tearing at the fragile mask of the Petton family. Judge Thornberry's inquiry unearthed undeniable evidence. Birth records had been altered, medical entries betrayed glaring inconsistencies, and whispers from surviving staff spoke of an infant exchange long buried in the year 1831. Under court protection, Marie was brought back from Savannah to Charleston. The reunion was both tender and unsettling, a collision of two lives that had grown in opposite worlds. Marie, though as brilliant as Charles, bore the heavy armor of slavery's scars, her spirit sharpened by survival, her eyes older than her years. When she learned the truth of their exchanged identities, her reaction was not relief but something far more haunting. Marie's reaction was not relief but fury, directed at the very adults who had shaped and twisted their lives for over a decade. "You stole 12 years from both of us," she declared to the Countess during their first tense encounter inside the Charleston courthouse. "12 years of my birthright, 12 years of his true identity. Nothing you do can return what you took." Her words cut through the marble chamber like a blade, echoing with decades of betrayal. But Marie's anger did not stop with the Countess. It turned toward Charles as well. She accused him of wielding the truth as another instrument of control. His carefully timed revelation, she argued, was not an act of rescue but a calculated decision made without her voice. "Did you ever ask me," she demanded during one of their supervised meetings, "if I wanted to be rescued? Did you ever consider that I had built connections, dreams, and goals that your version of justice would shatter?" Charles found himself facing questions he had never prepared for. His campaign for truth had been built like a chess match, but Marie's response forced him to realize that perhaps his motives had been driven as much by vengeance against the Countess as by concern for his sister's freedom. By September of 1843, Judge Thornberry issued his formal findings. The truth of the exchanged identities was legally recognized, and the court delivered its remedies. Marie was freed at last and granted her rightful share of the Pemberton inheritance. Celeste, too, received her liberty, along with a financial settlement to secure her future. On paper, justice had prevailed, yet the social fallout was far more devastating. Whispers spread like wildfire. The scandal that erupted consumed the Petton family's reputation, not only in Charleston, but across the wider South. Colonel Petton, weakened by illness, was forced to watch helplessly as the empire his family had built over 3 generations crumbled to dust. The Countess endured a swift and merciless ostracism, her name spoken in hushed tones at gatherings where once she had ruled. In October of 1843, she fled the city altogether, leaving only a single letter behind. In it, she confessed that she would spend her remaining years cloistered in a convent in France, seeking penance for sins that had shattered innocent lives. Charles had won the battle for truth, but at a cost that went far beyond his designs. Though he secured justice in the courts, Charleston society recoiled from him. They could not reconcile the idea of a former slave standing as heir to one of their most storied families. In the end, Charles was left isolated, branded not as a victor but as an outcast, his triumph shadowed by the same exile that had consumed the woman he had brought down. And so the aftermath of the Petton scandal left the city whispering, not of resolution, but of ruin. The scandal reverberated through Charleston society for decades, whispered behind lace fans, and in dimly lit drawing rooms as the ultimate warning of what could happen when powerful families buried their secrets too deeply. Yet the true weight of that March night in 1830, one was far more haunting than the neat morality tales that society crafted. Beneath the polished stories lay consequences far more tangled, consequences that would follow each of them like a shadow they could never escape. Charles Petton, now legally recognized as Charles Russell after the revelation of his bloodline, left Charleston in 1844. He walked away from the city of secrets carrying both an inheritance and a burden. In the gray streets of the North, he used his fortune to fund an education at Harvard Law School, where candle-lit libraries and echoing lecture halls became his refuge. He rose to prominence as an attorney, arguing cases that touched the very heart of racial identity and inheritance. His victories in court rippled outward, challenging the fragile structures of American society. And yet, for all his success, the hollow ache of 12 stolen years never released him. He lived alone, never marrying, never building deep friendships, as though trust itself had been stolen alongside his childhood. When he died in 1889, his private journals were discovered, pages filled with restless ink, questioning whether he had truly sought justice, or whether revenge had been the real compass guiding his life. Marie's path was even more fraught with shadows. The courts had freed her, yes, and wealth had been restored to her name, but no amount of inheritance could erase 12 years of chains. The glittering parlors of Charleston aristocracy were foreign to her, their expectations pressing down like a mask she could never quite wear. She clung to the world she had known, the community of slaves who had raised her, even as she was thrust into the role of an aristocrat. In time, she married a free man from Philadelphia and poured her inheritance into creating schools for freed slaves, leaving a legacy that shaped countless lives. Yet those closest to her whispered of an unshakable heaviness in her spirit. She had lived as a slave when she was born to be free, and the knowledge that her brother had been given privileges stolen from her birthright carved a quiet bitterness into every bond she formed. Celeste, however, charted the most surprising course. Where others staggered beneath the weight of revelation, she adapted with remarkable strength. Her newfound freedom and financial security became the foundation of a life rebuilt with quiet determination. In Charleston's free black community, she emerged as a respected figure, her steady hand guiding others through the bewildering legal mazes of freedom. With literacy and sharp organizational skill, she became a voice of direction for many who had once been voiceless. Unlike Charles and Marie, Celeste seemed to step out from the ashes with her spirit intact, a survivor who had not only endured but transformed her fate. Even Celeste, who had adapted better than most, carried invisible scars from the deception. In recollections preserved years later by historians of the antebellum South, she spoke of the heavy toll it had taken on her spirit. She had lived with the unbearable knowledge of seeing her own son raised as another woman's child, never able to call him by his true name. And though she walked free, she could never silence the truth that every privilege Charles had received had come at the cost of her daughter's stolen birthright. It was a wound that never closed. The Petton plantation itself became a silent monument to contradiction. After Colonel Petton's death in 1845, the property was sold off to cover debts and mounting legal claims. The once grand mansion stood abandoned for years, its empty windows staring out at Charleston like hollow eyes. Eventually, it was repurposed into a boarding house for merchant sailors. The same halls that had once echoed with secrets now carried the rough laughter of men who knew nothing of the darkness those walls had witnessed. But the story of the Petton scandal reached far beyond the family itself. Legal scholars who examined the case in the years that followed marveled at how fragile the very idea of racial identity had proven to be. Entire lives and rights had been determined by something as shallow as the shade of skin or the stroke of a pen. The switched infants exposed how society's classifications were not truths of nature, but fictions upheld by law and fear. Judge Thornberry himself, who had presided over the case, later filled his writings with its lessons, arguing that the scandal revealed cracks in America's legal foundations that no single verdict could ever repair. In Charleston, however, the case lived on as folklore. Over time, its details became twisted by the tellers. Some painted the Countess as a tragic woman destroyed by forces beyond her control. Others whispered that Charles himself had acted out of spite, tearing his family apart in pursuit of revenge. The haunting ambiguity of what truly happened gave way to neat tales that were easier to repeat, but far less truthful. And yet, buried within the legend was a deeper horror. How easily children's lives could be broken when judged not for who they were, but for what society demanded them to be. Charles and Marie carried those scars to their graves. Both had endured the shattering discovery that their entire identities had been constructed on deception, a cruel theater staged by those who claimed to love them. Neither ever found complete peace. And perhaps the Countess herself said it best in her final letter before leaving for France. Her words bled with regret. We sought to shield our children from cruelty. Instead, we delivered cruelties far greater than society ever could. The road to ruin is paved with good intentions, and ours, I fear, were very good indeed. The mansion on East Bay Street would not stand forever. In 1923, it was torn down, the same year a mysterious fire devoured courthouse records tied to the Petton case. Many suspected that descendants had arranged for evidence to disappear, ensuring no shame would touch their bloodline. But no proof was ever found. Today, only a small marker remains, cold and understated, noting the site as one of important legal proceedings of the antebellum South. It says nothing of switched children, of buried truths, or of the deadly pact that destroyed a dynasty. Visitors pass by, unaware of the secrets that may still rest beneath Charleston's manicured streets. And so the Petton scandal lingers, not just as a story of one family, but as a warning of how the sins of a single generation can echo for decades, poisoning lives and warping justice itself. What do you believe? Were such elaborate deceptions common in the South, hidden away behind gilded facades? Or was this case unique in its scope, an exception that history could not quite erase? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this tale as unsettling as we did, be sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share with those who crave stories that challenge our understanding of identity and truth. We'll see you in the next video, where another forgotten scandal awaits.